Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with your academic credentials, if we may. Very impressive career you've had, teaching at Oxford, and now coming to where you are today, leading executive programs globally. Can you just walk us through your journey that led to where you are today?
Yeah, I started really as what I would call an accidental academic. I never had a strong intention to go there. I discovered a doctorate program on the subject of innovation management about 25 years ago. I was really interested in that, applied, got in, did that for 4 years. Never intended to stay in academia, to be honest. But back then there was a mini recession. And the consultancies and private equity where I was looking to go weren't recruiting. So I ended up in a business school. Frankly, I was researching stuff I wasn't that interested in, but I discovered this thing called executive education and then ended up in Oxford running leadership programs. I spent 10 years as the associate dean overseeing that whole portfolio, which was about a $50 million business operating globally. And then latterly in my time at Oxford, I was running the advanced management and leadership program. So this was an incredible experience, 45 leaders from 30 countries, for 3 weeks in Oxford. And it was a real privilege to work with them. And I did that for 3 years and then left in November last year.
Fantastic. What was it like to sort of climb through the ranks at Oxford? Why was it that you were so successful, do you think?
God, that's a good question. I think because I enjoy really good practical academic stuff, really good research that executives find useful, and that being taken into a place where it connects with their issues. So it's not research for the sake of research, it's research which is really relevant to the issues that executives and leaders are facing. And on the other hand, I found I actually enjoyed running a business, which is what I was running. And in all of that, I love working globally. So I've worked across, clients in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Singapore, China, Brunei, Myanmar. You come across the world. I find it hard to find countries where I haven't got some experience. I think it's a combination of those three things, really.
And as you've just mentioned, you've worked with top tier leaders around the world. What was it that drew you toward leadership transformation as your life's work?
So I think I naturally gravitated, particularly in the last 5 years, to a place where I am trusted by leaders of some of the biggest organizations in the world, the CEOs, and also by some ministers of government as well. And I think it's the ability that I have to both work with the big strategic challenges that they're facing, but also the development challenges they're facing. Who do they need to be to successfully take their organizations forward? And also, what does that mean in the context of where the world is today? And it's the intersection of those three things, which is, I think, what really energizes me. And my view is that we need different types of leaders going forward, that there's been a kind of a shift in how the world is working. And that's, it's a privilege to be able to work in that space.
Fantastic. And I presume what you've just talked about there was what led you to found Transcend.
Exactly.
What was the particular problem that you were looking to solve?
So I think I can take this from two perspectives. One is, I think the problem is that traditional teaching coming out of business schools is not enough. It's not enough just to talk about what you need to do. Traditional consulting's not enough. It's not enough just to create a deck of slides and then think about how you make that happen. And it's not enough just to coach people, in a vacuum sometimes of what the really big strategic challenges are. It's a combination of all three. And that's really what Transcend.Space is about. The second problem we're solving is the leaders we're working with are increasingly extremely busy. And that affects their ability to think. It affects their ability to strategize, to make decisions. So Transcend.Space is, as it says, it's a space to transcend. Transcend means to move beyond. And that can mean move to a different business model. It can mean move to a different place of operating, to become a different type of leader to address the challenges that you're facing, and even to transcend some of the world's biggest challenges with solutions, practical solutions that work and that drive profitable growth. So, and the space could be a coaching space. It could be a space for an executive team. Often it means them stepping out of the busyness. So I'm right now in the city of London, full of busyness. And sometimes I work here. Sometimes you've got to go into, nature, because we know if you spend 2 or 3 days in nature, it changes you. And I've seen that with executive teams. They slow down and go into a different, more reflective space, and they can address some of those challenges that I'm talking about.
How do you think your combination of your academic and your consulting experiences, how do they come together to really complement each other in achieving these goals that you've laid out there?
Yeah. So I think having spent 25 years or so in the business school world, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of different models, call them theories, ways of thinking, empirical data, etc. And also through my coaching and consulting, I'm familiar with how do you really listen. So my primary focus is to really listen. It's to really be with where a leader's at, where an organization's at. Where necessary, I can bring some, academic understanding to that. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. Frankly, most of the time, it's about helping them understand the way forward, understanding the thresholds that they need to cross, the edges that they're at. Becoming deeply aware of those so that they then can move beyond them or move through them. In some ways, anything that I have that's academic is in service of that. And so it's one of a number of different things that I use in terms of my work.
Sounds like a really key part of what you do as well is relationship building, and particularly, I guess, building trust.
Exactly.
With these execs.
Exactly.
I mean, you're working with some of the, like you said, some of the busiest and most high-profile executives around the world. How do you go about even just getting that first block of time with them? And then how do you develop that into a close and trusting relationship that you share going forward?
Yeah. So often the starting point is through personal recommendation. I guess the person has to be ready. They have to see the time as being a worthwhile investment. I'll talk a little bit more about that because, I've got some really examples of how people have created quite a lot of time and they're not as, well, the busyness actually comes from a need to control. And some of what we're doing is letting go of that. And then I think it's about personal chemistry, do they want to work with me? I think there are certain things which are a given, confidentiality. And I really try to listen. I really try to understand. When you're working globally, you can't really, come with a lot of assumptions. Where people are in a business in, a fast-growing economy like Saudi Arabia compared to, an emerging market in another part of the world, compared to a more mature economy like the US, but that still might have some fast-growing businesses. It's about deeply listening to people and deeply listening to what they're struggling with, deeply listening to where the opportunities are. If I could touch on, the busyness aspect, one of the CEOs I'm working with, when I met him, if you can just picture this, I walked into his office and he had about 20 files stacked up, paper files, and probably as many on his iPad as well. Yeah. And he had a lot of energy. This guy could work like a machine, to be honest. And so very quickly I realized that there was a certain type of leadership there. And, and first of all, I needed to listen to him. Yeah. I needed to listen to where he was struggling. And what he basically said was that were some things he needed to spend time on that he didn't have time to do. So I gave him a challenge. I said, right, I want you to first of all audit your time. Just basically for the next 4 weeks, write down all the things you're working on. Use your assistant to code your diary if that's useful. And then let's have a look. So we met after that, and I said, right, I want you to either give away or stop doing 10% of what you're doing. And he said, that's impossible. I said, no, go away and have a go. He was really into sport and fitness. So I said, consider me like a trainer. We're going to go from doing a deadlift of 70 kilograms and we're going to go to 80. So go away and have a go at it. Yeah. So anyway, he came back and said, I've done it. And he said, actually, I've got more time with my family. I'm not working as late. So it took a bit of the pressure off. Yeah. So I said, right, I want you to go to 20%. He said, oh, that's impossible. So I said, go and have a go. So give it away or stop doing it. Got to 20%, right? And then I said, all right, I want you to go to 30%. And he said, listen, Andrew, this is just way too much. I said, go and give it a go. Anyway, next time we met, he came to me and said, you're not going to believe it. I've got to 30%. And over the next 6 to 9 months, I can see my way to 70%. And he said, it's opening up a massive opportunity around working more with regulators, because it was a regulated company, working more on business development, really doubling down on the digitization agenda. And in front of me, he pointed to this file and he said, there are 10 documents in there. There are no documents on my desk. And I have got now bought a shredder and my cap is 10 documents. So I don't take more than 10. So if the discipline is, if another one comes in, one has to go. It has to be basically either completed or handed over to somebody. And it's totally transformed the way he's led. Yeah. It's opened up space for him to work on the real bigger priorities. I would say, as important, it's also meant his team have had to step up. So it's changed the dynamic with his team. And so the whole organization is more resilient, so to speak.
And engaged, I would imagine. They're being trusted.
And engaged and developing themselves and growing themselves. And so this has huge impact. It moves the needle on some of the biggest metrics in that organization and gives him the headspace to really lead. So he's had to let go of something. He's had to let go of, at a practical level, some of the stuff he was doing, but he's also had to let go of his need to control. And that's where the interplay between the strategic and the personal actually, really come together.
Yeah. And for this individual, and I imagine we can speak about this individual because it's probably familiar to lots of people that are listening to this kind of case. Yeah. Was it purely a mindset issue, or were there some skills that he needed to develop in terms of how to delegate?
Yes, there were some skills. So there was a kind of a shift in terms of how much he was speaking, the ratio between how much he was speaking and how much he was listening. Yeah. And so that ratio needed to move more towards listening than speaking. It required the use of open questions rather than closed questions, because that really brings somebody in. It required a way of delegating and him not taking things on, and in some ways pushing a lot more back on the team to do the job that they were paid to do.
And you mentioned before, sort of previously, it's really important that people are in the right space and that they're open to sort of grow and learn. Making time is one thing, but actually being open to learning. How do you know, if you're speaking with someone, how do you know that that person's truly ready to listen and to learn?
Yeah, so often what I'm doing is trying to understand, are they at a threshold? So is there something going on in the organization that is requiring them to lead in a different way and the organization to operate in a different way? So I can give you some concrete examples of this. I worked with one person who said that we are spending more on fines than we are on R&D. So essentially, we're spending more on the past and the problems of the past than we are investing in the future. another organization that was right in the middle of disruption. And they had too much capital and time invested in the old paradigm and not enough capital and time invested in the new paradigm. It can even be that they're doing too much firefighting around the current model and not enough thinking about the future model. Too much time spent on operational problems and not enough time with customers. They may even say, I feel like we're just going round and round in a circle and we're not moving forward. So I'm looking for, I suppose, a couple of things. What's out of balance? Because when things are out of balance, they don't thrive. I'm also looking for, are they at a threshold? Are they at a point where things have to change in the organization, in themselves? And that can simply be that they are at risk of falling over because they're just taking on too much and they need to evolve into a different form of leadership and to be more settled. And so helping them through that. They can also be at a much more, I suppose, a threshold where they're moving from being a privately held business going through an IPO or through a big shift in terms of how their board or their governance structure is constructed as well. But it's where the needle needs to move on something. And we see that manifest in changes in major metrics. Yes. So that could be things like cost to income, revenues flatlining. We need to get that growing again, or so that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and I guess the point is with that is that if there needs to be a major change, kind of business as usual or doing things in the same way isn't gonna meet that goal. So being able to bring in that external support who can help you look at things completely differently.
Exactly. Yeah. And, sometimes I get, this is going to cost a certain amount. And I'm like, if our work together brings about success, my fee should be a fraction of the business improvement. Right. And so, because we're working with senior people, we're moving the needle on some pretty big metrics. And so whether that's return on equity or, top line growth, reduction in cost or something like that.
Completely. And what advice would you give to an executive who finds themselves in this kind of space that we've just described? They need to take the company in a different direction. There's a major metric that needs to be addressed. How should they go about sort of seeking support or help?
Yeah, so I think you first of all got to find somebody that you trust, that you have some rapport with, that is going to bring some experience of having seen this before, can really help you understand how to move forward. And I'm amazed, actually, sometimes, David, that I can be, particularly if I'm doing this remote, sometimes I feel like, not always, but sometimes, that I don't know what I'm doing other than listening. So I can be on a Teams call or Zoom call, and I'm with a CEO, and they talk for probably 55 minutes. I am asking a couple of clarifying questions, and at the end of it, there's a part of me that I'm not sure how useful I was. So I'll ask, was that useful? Oh my goodness, Andrew, it's been so useful. I've just been able to talk. And then, you discover I can't talk to my board in this way. I can't talk to my team in this way. I don't want to bring this home to my family. I just need to be able to talk. I need to be able to talk it through, talk about options, talk in a way where I can almost hear the echo of my own voice. And through that process, start to understand the way forward. So I think if that gives you a sense of it, now then it might move into a much more practical piece of work where we are, crafting a deck of slides to really make the strategy go from being implicit to explicit. We're thinking through how that gets presented to shareholders. or to a board or to an executive team. We're working out where the risks are. We're trying to understand where the upside is, how to position the messaging. Now that's much more hands-on, but before that, there just needs to be a set of space to talk and to process some things.
Isn't that amazing when people do give themselves that safe space to just communicate and think through? Very often those answers are inside them. It's just
Exactly.
they have to quiet the noise and get there. I think that's also the
Exactly.
role of nature you talked about before can be very helpful in that journey.
Exactly. And sometimes that can be a Teams call, a Zoom call. Sometimes that's I go into their office to do that. With some of my clients, I take them walking. Sometimes we take whole teams out into nature. And that's usually when there's something a bit bigger that needs to have some time to really focus on it. But nature is it has a way of quietening the mind and taking people into a different space.
Talk to us a bit of a segue here, but I know you're working on an event later this year, an executive gathering.
Yep.
Talk to us about that event, what the goal is of it, and who should be attending.
Yeah, so this is our first global leadership retreat. It's being held at a beautiful location about 2.5 hours from London. It is aimed at leaders from around the world who want to spend 4 days in nature, but also going through a reflective process about themselves, what their purpose is, what their contribution is, what their real impact is on the world, but also practically where their organization might be stuck, what the opportunities are. It's really taking a lot of the things that we're talking about and putting it into a compressed 4-day process with a lot of support, with an incredible community of other leaders from around the world who will bring difference and will bring something similar, and with some support after the event as well. In terms of what we might call integration work. So how do you take the learnings back into the organization? And we've also already got people signed up from governments around the world, from business around the world, and we're building we've got the content and the process and the venue booked, and we're just finishing off the recruitment of the participants.
Fantastic. And can you take us just through what an agenda of a sort of 4-day event like that looks like?
Yes. So we would start with a very experiential process, essentially, of who is in the room. I did this recently, and it was quite interesting. We asked 50 leaders as to a number of questions to help them get to know each other. But one of them was, what was the transformation challenge that they were working on? And historically, what we would have seen is, supply chain or customer or finance or operating model. This time, 70% of them said whole organization, and it was a notable difference. So there's something interesting there. So something, to go back to your question, something about how, we need to build them as a group. We need to understand what are the specific challenges that they're working on, and what do they want to get out of the event. We then need to kind of bring in some topics. So we'll start to bring in the whole concept of purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? Are you in the right place? What is your organization doing? Is it in the right place? We'll go then more into a deeper reflective process. And we actually use some poetry, which works incredibly well to move people in that place quickly, as surprising as that might sound. And that's really around what is the sound of the genuine for you. And it gets to the deepest and in some ways the quietest part of a person. And it's where the most profound energy is. From that, we start to come out and we start to say, well, okay, what does all this mean? How does this change the way you lead? How does it change the way the organization operates? And we finish in a very practical action planning type format.
Got it. So you start with sort of the personal work looking at the grand challenge, and then
Yep.
coming out of this retreat with real sort of actionable items that you can
Exactly.
take back into
Exactly.
to,
And what we will bring in as well, where relevant, because there are some big changes going on in the world, which we might want to touch on. What are the types of leaders and the types of business models that are emerging that we might want to look at and learn from? And what might that mean to current businesses? And how might that inspire, really, and open people's minds to what might be possible?
Completely. I think you mentioned there 70% of leaders thinking they needed to do large organizational change. I mean, what do you think are the biggest challenges generally that leaders are facing?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about 5 that I see. And I'll start with what I think is the most shocking, and this is based on what I've heard over the last 3 months. And it's about the extent to which AI is going to transform organizations. So these are 4 people I've spoken to. One said that it's going to reduce their headcount down to 20% of what it currently is. So they will only need 20% of their employees to run their current business. Somebody else said, this gets more dramatic, they only need 10%.
Oh.
Somebody else said they only need 5%. Somebody else said that they think they can only need 2.5%. This was to run a finance function, not the whole business. This was just to run a finance function. Yeah. Now, that is the potential of the technology at the moment. They said they realized that it's a big job to get there, but it is coming. So that's kind of challenge 1, which is a complete rewiring of an organization through technology. The second is about the consequences of climate change. And I know this is it's politicized in some parts of the world at one level, but you can't deny the data at another level. And, we're seeing parts of the world in drought, in flood. We're seeing the consequences of that across, the US, across Latin America, across Europe. I think in the UK, we had wildfires in April, which I can never remember. They usually came in August or early September. And I don't think I can remember 1 or 2 days of serious rain in the last 3 months. Point 2. Point 3, I think there's something around human potential. And I think the organizations that can get the best out of people, that in many ways can integrate an individual's personal purpose and values and what they care about and their ambitions into a bigger goal of what the organization cares about and what it's trying to do. To me, this is an absolute critical leadership skill. We're seeing some interesting academic evidence around this as being at the heart of successful transformation. So something about human potential, something about globalization. And I think this is about adjusting to new normals around the tariff agenda, around the sanctions agendas, around the way in which the global economy is being rewired. And I think will continue to be rewired. Yeah. And then the final one is just continual profitable growth. It's the thing that all shareholders are looking for. It's the thing that funds our pensions. And it's the thing that funds taxation. And so in some ways, there's a whole combination of things in there. What I would say is when you put all those things together, there's something really important. And I would put it like this. I think we are now in an age of disruption. I think most people would say that is beyond debate. The problem we've got is that most organizations, particularly larger organizations, and the leaders of larger organizations have been trained and developed and operate in an incremental way. They've got governance structures that underpin incremental change. And what we need is leaders that can lead through disruption to produce a transformation, often a total transformation of a business model. And I would see as being one or a major part of what I and we are trying to do.
That's huge. There's so much there, and it's,
Yeah,
you know, as a leader who's trying to lead through all these things, could feel quite lonely, I guess, at times when you're
yeah,
taking on these challenges. Um, Fatigue can be a very real thing, right? When you feel
yeah.
like every day there's a new problem. Are you seeing that in your work?
Absolutely. I think I would add a few more. So the loneliness, yes. Who can I trust?
Mm,
Who can I talk to about this? Um, the fatigue, particularly for people who are under huge delivery pressures and or are working across global time zones. I mean, I know in my work, sometimes I can be on a call at 6 in the morning to the Middle East or Asia, and then on a call, towards 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night into the US. So those of us who work across time zones, it can be exacerbated. And then when you put travel onto that as well, exacerbated even more. Um, I think as well, fear, you know, anxiety, stress. Sometimes it takes a while for people to be honest about what they're really feeling. Because they have to portray a sense of confidence, quite rightly,
yeah,
even that they just don't know,
yeah,
and being able to be comfortable with the fact they don't know. I think having somebody who can be there for that, not judge them, not see that as a point of weakness, and at the same time say, okay, we need to address the fact that your cost to income ratio is going in the wrong direction, or we need to address the fact that your capital allocation is not in the right place. And what could success look like? Because that's what's motivating. What could transformation look like? What could a vision of the future look like? How might we get there? How do you create an inspirational message around that? So it's about being able to be present with both the technical and the personal, the strategic and the personal. I think that is where the real essence of leadership transformation is today.
completely. And that's why doing things like executive retreats can be so important, right? Like giving yourself that time and space to review what your purpose is, because if you're not sort of purpose driven and doing something that you're centered towards doing,
Yep.
life can get very, very difficult, and you end up fighting battles that you don't even know you're
Yep.
fighting, right?
Yeah. Well, it can get difficult. It can be de-energizing when you have a real sense of what your vocation or purpose, and I'm indifferent to the language that people use to describe it. It can be hugely energizing. It can be hugely clarifying to an organization to know what its purpose is. It can guide investment decisions. It can guide priorities. I often find that when you work 1 or 2 levels down in an organization, people are crying out to know what that is because it's inspirational. And we know from some of the research that we've done is that it creates a massive increase in discretionary effort. So it's hugely motivating. And it opens people's minds to what is possible for them, what is possible for the organization. And it gives resilience to get through some of the challenges that addressing some of the shifts that I talk about can mean.
And what do some of the great leaders that you work with, what is it they do differently when the pressure is high and the pace is relentless like it is?
They know how to schedule their time. So this isn't time management. It's much more sophisticated than that, I would say, is number one. They know who they need to talk to. They have an ability to maintain an anchor of stillness within themselves, or come back to an anchor of stillness. And that is found either through sport, through exercise, through meditation, through walking in nature. So there's something around the renewal. They know how to work politically, both within the organization and with the board. They know how to listen. And I think this is probably one of the most underestimated and yet profound skills that is out there. So in my work, I've asked about 2,500 leaders, not people who are at the very top of organizations, but generally 2 or 3 levels down, about their experiences of successful and unsuccessful transformation. And one of the questions we ask is, what were leaders doing? What differentiates successful leaders from unsuccessful leaders? And it is nearly always about listening and communication. It's a bit more complicated than straightforward listening, because it's listening and doing things that ensure that people feel heard. And it's listening and responding in a way that creates actions that, in a sense, clarify and allow people to move forward with positive energy, allows situations to be unstuck. So to go back to your question, it's about listening and understanding, if we're at a threshold or an edge or a turning point, what needs to be unlocked? What needs to shift? Who needs to get together? And what do we need to focus on to move either a part of the organization or the whole organization forward? And so there are some approaches that we've seen that lead to profound success if they got right, and to really moving to a new level of operating and a new level of performance.
And the listening and communication, I mean, hear it all the time, right? I think everyone knows they need to listen and they need to communicate, but I always kind of think it's an art form, perhaps more than a science sometimes.
Yeah.
What do you say to, let's say you're coaching an exec? You probably ask them, have you communicated what the purpose is? Are you listening to your people? What are some of the signs that execs are listening well and communicating well? And what are some of the perhaps warning signs that they're not doing that maybe as well as they think?
Okay, so I use a couple of techniques whenever I'm working with a CEO to really understand them, not just through their own words, but through the words of the people that are around them. So I use a very sophisticated questionnaire-based tool, which has got a lot of very good theory around organizational success baked into it. And I also use interviews with a number of people. So I'm trying to paint a picture. So I will pick up whether or not they are listening and communicating. Some of the traps that they can fall into is that they, on the one hand, sugarcoat the pill. So they don't address the elephant in the room or however you want to describe it. And for whatever reason, they are allowing things in the organization to fester or to, not be resolved. Number one. Number two, they withdraw into a place of judgment and, into more of an inner state, and they shut up, but not in a way that allows other people to speak. They withdraw. And then the final one is they can go into excessive or hyper controlling. And that, if you've ever been, and I've been in places where you've got somebody like that, you withdraw. You become very responsive. You stop thinking for yourself. So the data profile that I use will give me an indication of those things. To go back to your point about listening, there are some techniques you can use. So I think some of this can be taught. Bits are about more of an inner state. The bits that can be taught are, rather than responding with what you think, you can summarize what the other person has said. So it would go, David, what I think you're saying is, this is what I've heard. Can I check that if I'm correct? And you can use open questions, not a closed question. A closed question would be, what time did you arrive at work today? You might say 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. And an open question would be, David, I understand you've just been on holiday. How was it? And one, you just give a straight answer. Another is much more expansive and shows you that I'm listening. So there are some techniques you can use here, as well as having to be in a different inner state and perhaps some areas where there needs to be a deeper level of development.
Yeah, and I can completely see how when a leader enters the withdrawn sort of state or phase that you laid out there, how that can become damaging. What's for execs and leaders listening to this? What's a thought that might enter your mind that indicates you're probably in a withdrawn type of state?
So that you have a lot of internal narrative going on about people and situations in the organization. You feel like you're holding quite a lot of stress about that. You might be being quite critical or judgmental about the organization without fully understanding. You may have looked at your diary and realized that you have practically withdrawn. You're not spending time walking the floor, doing professional socializing, even to the more extreme. And, I witnessed this in one organization where 2 senior execs hadn't spoken for 9 months. So where is conflict kind of present in the organization and is not being resolved? Where are relationships breaking down? Where are there difficulties with certain board members or certain direct reports where, there is a shift in the relationship into not a good place? And in a sense, where have you become passive around that? Rather than actively trying to resolve it. These are some of the things I would look at.
As you list those, I think anyone listening will clearly understand those are all bad things.
Yeah.
No one wants these things to be present. But unfortunately,
it's life.
They're life, and they're probably everywhere in every business, no matter how good that business is.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which is...
Yeah. And, they are also, let's reframe them. They are areas where there is profound opportunity. And why do I say that? Because whenever energy is stuck, and that's really what we're talking about here, it can also flow. And we've all probably got experiences where a relationship's not been in a good place, but through certain interventions, the air's cleared, people have got things off their chest, they've been able to move forward, and energy starts to flow again. You can feel it. And in an organization, that can have a profound effect, because if there is a breakdown in relationship at the top between the CEO and a direct report, or between 2 people in the organization who are on the executive, the teams know about it. It doesn't just affect those 2 individuals. It affects, perhaps tens or even hundreds of people in terms of how the organization isn't moving forward. So conflict has a huge financial consequence to an organization, or, the types of things we're talking about, because of the leveraged negative impact. Consequently, if you can find a way to resolve it, it can have a virtuous circle of leveraged impact on the upside. And so having people who are skilled at knowing how to resolve this as a leadership skill, I think is critical, because when disruption goes up, so does stress. When things start to become more difficult, so does stress. It brings whether we call it the shadows or the more dysfunctional places that we might go to as leaders to the surface.
I often find as well, sort of the anxiety or stress that you can face as a leader, quite often that comes not from worrying about what's to come, but you're anxious because there's something you've not done, or there's an issue you've not addressed, and that can really create that anxiety.
Exactly.
So by cleaning that up. you can release that energy, like you said. And
Yeah.
what do you think? We talked before. You broke down some sort of the five key areas where leaders are facing challenges. What does the future of leadership look like to you
Yeah.
in this new world?
So I think there is going to be something about the profound rewiring of organizations due to AI and other digital technologies. So that is a critical skill, which is, I would say, at best 30% about technology, probably less, and it's about organizational change. There is also a really critical skill around how do you create organizations that get the best out of people. And I would say that the social contract between people and organizations has changed, particularly for the younger generation. And so you can't assume that a salary and a set of terms and conditions is enough. It's about weaving their uniqueness into belonging. And that's something that I think so far some people do really well, but it's not through training. And then when you wrap all of those things up and put climate in there as well, I think we're going to start to see the emergence of some very different business models, some very different organizations. Some organizations are going to make it, some won't. We're going to see some new organizations be developed by entrepreneurs. So I think we're going to go further into a time of profound destruction and creation. And at times like this, there are significant business opportunities. I think leaders have a choice. What side of history are you going to be on? Are you going to stay in your incrementalist box and try and preserve the status quo, or cross the thresholds, the personal thresholds, the business thresholds, and actually create the future? And that process isn't easy. It isn't always clear, but it's about what your intention is. So I think history is going to look back on, perhaps the next 10, 20 years as a time when a profound change took place. It's like, who are the leaders that are going to be successful going through that, and who are the ones that aren't? That's, I think, quite a basic choice.
Yeah. I think most people will say they want to be on the correct side of history if given the choice.
Yeah.
How do you put yourself on that path?
Yeah. I think the starting point that I have seen is that you have to acknowledge that an aspect of the status quo is unsustainable, and start to bring that into consciousness. That's like a muscle, right? So it can be that a relationship between two execs is unsustainable. It could be that our strategy is running out of road. It could be that we are producing too much carbon as a business and we know we're going to get taxed for that. It can be that we know our culture is a status quo that's not sustainable. And so by recognizing something's unsustainable, you are open to it being different. And it's the first place, or the first part of doing it. Now, what I would add is a word of caution. Be careful who you do that with, because it can throw an organization into a state of chaos or a state of dysfunction. So that's about having a trusted group of people that you can go through that process with. So that's the starting point. And from there, you can start to understand what needs to change and how do we go through both a process to reimagine the future, and then to understand what that means to us as leaders. How do we need to step up? What does the pathway look like for that? And what does the action plan look like?
How optimistic are you about the direction that leadership is heading? And do you feel that the leaders of today are going to make that choice to be on the right side of history?
Yeah, two great questions. I am optimistic by nature, and I'm optimistic when I look at history. I think we are, with the benefit of hindsight, profoundly creative, profoundly adaptive. We've created incredible technology. I don't know what society is going to look like when, even if we take a conservative estimate, 60% of today's jobs won't exist. What are the new jobs that might be created, or what does it mean in a world where there's less employment? I think there are some big unknowns there. Will today's leaders make that transition? It's a good question. Will it require a younger generation of leaders to step in? I don't know, frankly. I think it will depend organization by organization, country by country, industry by industry. And where will the ideas, where will the businesses, the technologies come from? You know, will they come from today's big businesses, or will they come from startups and the venture capital world? And I suspect it will be a combination of both. What I do know is that there is a different, call it spirit, call it culture, call it mindset in some large businesses, that they are up for more disruptive change, particularly with what AI may enable. And we know change is a bit like a muscle. Once you start to exercise it, it starts to be more capable. And if you think about what we've gone through really since 2008, that muscle has got much stronger. The global financial markets seem to be more resilient to things. So there is more of an adaptive or an innovative or a transformational capability, I think, in large organizations, which makes me more confident that they will, still be around in 20, 30 years. Some of them, because of that.
Yeah. And I think even in people generally, if you look at the way people have had to adopt sort of new technologies, new ways of working, new ways of living
exactly
over the last 10 to 15 years, that tells me that there's a lot of this kind of wave of change and adversity will hopefully unleash an even bigger wave of innovation and ideas and opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah. And you think about just since 2010, the familiarity that we've got with technologies like this, and how cheap this has become to do this recording. You're in Nashville, I'm in London. We would have needed a lot of big infrastructure to do this before. Now it's still quite sophisticated, but it's a lot cheaper. I haven't been in a bank in 10 years. It's all done on an app. There's some incredible technologies out there. I'm starting to use AI in my work, and finding ways to make it really useful. So I think you're right. Our ability to adapt is quite incredible, and particularly adapt under stress.
Yes, I think so too. I think we're a far more capable species than perhaps we give ourselves credit for sometimes.
Yeah.
And finally,
yes,
what message would you give to CEOs and leaders listening today who feel they're at a crossroads?
Yeah. Don't stay in the prison of busyness. Find a way to create the space for you at an appropriate point for the teams around you, to balance that state of busyness with a space of reflection. Try and find the right questions that are going to unlock what's stuck and where the potential is. I use some ones like, what are we not talking about that we need to talk about? What do we always talk about, what we never resolve? what would be different in 3 years if we address the things that we're not talking about? And so let's go from the problem to the solution. Um, you know, a simple bit of paper. I actually did a post on LinkedIn today. And it's a very basic map that I use with a lot of the CEOs that I work with. Kind of, where are you today? Bottom left-hand corner. And where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? By when? Top right-hand corner. And what does the pathway between those two things look like? So coming down to some simple, things that capture the essence of how a conversation needs to be opened. And, so within all of that, helping people to process through some of the emotion where necessary, to really go from a place of perhaps stress or anxiety, even fear, to possibility, intention, clarity on the way forward, high performance, potential, and all of these things.
Andrew, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great. Thank you. Really interesting conversation.